So the first season of The Handmaid's Tale came out a few months into the first Trump presidency and in many ways was in direct conversation with the news cycle. The final season has just returned. Once again, that show is landing in a politically fraught time. Can The Handmaid's Tale meet the moment? The group chat's here. Let's go. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, I don't have to tell you the lasting impact of The Handmaid's Tale. Margaret Atwood's book turns 40 this year, and in that time it has become shorthand for a lot of different political anxieties. So much so that when the first season of the TV adaptation came out, right after President Trump took office, the first time around, people started showing up to protests in the handmaids' long red robes and the bonnets and the white bonnets. And that was like the statement, right? It's like this TV show is, in fact, this story in this TV show does something to capture the moment, to speak to the political moment that America is in at that time. The sixth and final season of The Handmaid's Tale is arriving now in the middle of all of these tensions between Canada and the United States, and it has a lot to say about power.
It's not a good time to be an American in Canada.
Oh, that's news.
They're getting ready to shut this place down. The cabinet wants to start normalizing relations with Gilead. That would mean de-recognizing the United States.
We can't just let them win.
Normalizing relationships with Gilead. Yeah, sure. Those are the times we're in. To talk about The Handmaid's Tale and the moment that it's landing in, Arizona O'Neill is back on the show, and Moira Donegan is here for the first time. Arizona, Moira, blessed day to both of you.
Hi. Blessed day.
Hello.
Yes. Should I reply, may the Lord open?
Please don't, actually. Please do not. Do not do so. Arizona, before we start talking about this, I'm curious. What is, to you, the power of the story, the power of The Handmaid's Tale?
Well, like you said, since the beginning of the Trump presidency, when this show started, women have been coming to protest dressed as handmaids. And I think it's really important to have, TV shows and books to show as an example, as a cautionary tale, because as a society, history does repeat itself, but it's hard to point at history when we don't have characters like we do in television shows to identify with. So it's very, very important for us to have these works of fiction to point at as an example and a frame of reference.
Yeah, this idea that like these characters sort of fix us in place. They say this represents some of these forces that are coalescing here. And I want to return to that in just a moment. But maybe, Moira, you write about gender in America and feminism, and you just wrote this piece in The New Yorker about this final season of The Handmaid's Tale and how you think it's maybe not living up to its potential in terms of this particular moment. Before we get to that, I think like there's a baseline here, right? Which is to say this show and this story kind of used to do that or did that a little bit better. So if we can maybe rewind back to 2017 when this show first came out, what kind of impact did it have then when it came out?
Yeah, at the time, debuting in April 2017, just a few months after Trump's election and then his first inauguration, the show was understood really as prophetic, and it had this explosion of interest and symbolic weight, like Arizona was referring to. And what it did was it seemed to anticipate what American women could expect from a Trumpist future. So if you rewind back to 2017, nobody knew exactly how it was going to happen. But the election of Donald Trump shifted the overturn of Roe v. Wade, the sort of like sword of Damocles that had been hanging over American women, from an if to a when. Right. And so American women started thinking about what it would mean for their citizenship, for their sense of themselves, for their sense of the possibilities for their lives and their participation in public life to change with the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And the show became a symbol of all of those fears for the future and of a feminist movement whose gains were being threatened.
Arizona, I'm curious about your read of, maybe we'll root ourselves in the novel for just a moment, because I do want to get to the TV show when we get there in just a minute. But, Roe v. Wade is in the 1970s. Margaret Atwood is responding to everything that is happening in America, and in doing so, creating and writing The Handmaid's Tale, a book that comes out 40 years ago. So we're talking about, 1985. You first read the book when you You were in high school. The show comes out after that. How did the story help you navigate your own understanding of the world, Arizona?
Well, I think when I read it in high school, I was in a very naive place, like most of us, and it seemed so far-fetched and more of a critique maybe on religion, but you can't take out the fact that it was written by a Canadian and it was a criticism on America. So that's what's so
Hmm.
interesting when the TV show came out and it's so heavily American. So it's interesting for Americans to take back this piece of literature and produce it themselves. But, I just feel like Handmaid's Tale has been with me my entire life. It's
Hmm.
such a staple in Canadian culture, interestingly enough. And every season, as I return to it, it's more and more painful. But this past season, I'm approaching it, more hopeful. And yeah, it just affected me greatly in being weary of governments, for sure.
It's occurred to me that there will be some folks who have never read The Handmaid's Tale, who've never watched this TV show. I like the expression of surprise that you just had in Moira. Like, what are you doing? If you're not familiar with the fundamental tenets of The Handmaid's Tale is a book, is a dystopian future, a world where the United States becomes a theocratic, totalitarian state, renamed Gilead. It is basically functions around the Old Testament, but there are virtually no rights for women in this particular society. For anyone who's not maybe familiar with the story and the details of the story, I think like we use the words like prophetic, Moira, to talk about what Margaret Atwood managed to do. When you consider the scenarios that Atwood wrote about that have come to pass in real life, what examples jump out for you? What kind of stands out as like, oh, she did kind of call that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting when you talk about how the reception of the show has changed, right? Because one thing that was very true when that first season came out in 2017 is that the show seemed to be looking forward to what American women could expect
Hmm.
from this changed government. And now we're looking backward a little bit, right? So, we are in a situation where Roe v. Wade really was overturned in June of 2022, and abortion is now illegal and criminalized in vast swaths of the United States. We're looking at a world in which a lot of women really are dying in America
Hmm.
because they live in states that value their reproductive capacity more than their health, more than their very lives. And we've also seen in the Trump administration something, not totally unlike Gilead's regime of kidnapping and redistribution of children with the family separation policy that has been inflicted on immigrant families to the United States. The showrunner of The Handmaid's Tale gave an interview to the Washington Post where she said that, she consulted all of these UN experts and, psychological experts for a scene in the second season in which June, the main character, is reunited with her kidnapped daughter, Hannah, who's been snatched away from her and taken to be raised by another family in Gilead. And then just days after that episode premiered, the Trump administration announced its family separation policy.
Hmm.
Margaret Atwood has said in some interviews that everything she wrote about in The Handmaid's Tale, every instance of women's oppression, sexual oppression, reproductive oppression, all these like sort of creative sadisms were in fact inspired by history, right? And in some sense, we have seen a lot of that history repeating over the past decade.
Okay, so now let's set the context because you mentioned June. So let's go a little bit deeper into the show. We spent a bunch of time setting the stage here, but just to bring us up to speed in terms of the context of this season, Arizona. So June is the main character. June Osborne is played by Elizabeth Moss. You said she's one of your all-time favorite female characters. For anyone who's not watching, can you just bring us up to speed? What is June grappling with right now?
Well, in season 5, there was a very, she was all about revenge. And then when she finally received her revenge, it was unfulfilling, of course, as it always is.
Yeah.
And so in season 6, she's in Canada as a refugee and she's forced to leave to Alaska. And now she's finally joining the rebellion, Mayday, in an attempt to save her daughter. And so that's an arc that goes through the entire show, which might seem repetitive, but I think to achieve a goal as big as she's trying to do, it takes a repetition. It's not an easy task. And I always see it as the way that she won't leave Hannah, her daughter, behind in Gilead is the same way that I can't leave June behind in this world, and why I keep returning to the show. It's almost like a chore at this point. It's like, because I need to make sure that June is okay. So hopefully, I'm glad that this is the last season, because I'm determined for there to be a resolution of some sort.
But this is where we have a bit of an away team, in our midst here, because the two of you kind of diverge a little bit. Moira, June has been seen by some folks as a powerful symbol of the feminist resistance, but you said you're kind of disappointed in her character arc. Why the disappointment?
I like Arizona. I'm really rooting for June, even though she starts to frustrate me.
Sure.
Because the narrative requirements of the season of this renewed show have required June to go back into Gilead over and over again, even after she escapes to Canada at the end of season 3. And this has been accompanied by a shift in the show's perspective. So while in the first couple of seasons, the show was, particularly the first season, the show was very committed to its feminist interpretation of Gilead, to its investment in the politics that emerge from Gilead's central horror, which is about ritualized rape and forced childbearing. But in the latter seasons, as June becomes more complicated, she develops real emotional investments in Gilead, including with members and participants in the Gilead regime. And she has a investment in the sort of redemption of those characters and of people in Gilead that I think sort of complicates the feminist message of the show a little bit. Arizona spoke a little bit about the show's 4th and 5th season, which dwell on women's rage and revenge in the wake of sexual violence and how it's unfulfilling. I think you can interpret that and those seasons, which were written, I believe, in the aftermath of Me Too, as really a reflection on that movement and sort of a cautioning against what some have seen as a vengeful or rageful kind of feminism that doesn't maybe brook a lot of possibility for restoration and repair.
I think a little bit of what you're getting at is that there's been maybe not entirely conciliatory approach, but maybe a softening of the way that resistance shows up. And I want to return to that in just a moment. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. The 6th and final season of The Handmaid's Tale just landed on Crave. Arizona O'Neil is here. Moira Donegan is here. And we're talking about how this show lands in this moment that we're in. And I want you to take a listen to this. It's a scene from the latest episode.
Your refugees put an unmanageable burden on Canada, and yet we cannot in good conscience send them back when you're still mutilating and murdering your own people.
I can promise you, there will be no human rights violations here.
Arizona, it's not lost on me that I listen to that dialogue and I also read the news, and I see that in Quebec, in the province where you live, the number of refugees crossing over from the United States into Canada is at an all-time high. And so we have Canadians pushing back against all the refugees coming up from Gilead, which is, again, this totalitarian state that the United States has become. What kind of character is Canada in The Handmaid's Tale this season?
Well, what I find interesting is that Canada is a character in the show. And that comes from remembering that it is a Canadian who wrote the story. And if it wasn't for Margaret Atwood, I actually don't think that Canada would be a character in the show. And the way that it's developed, I think it's actually very reflective of how Americans see Canadians. Every time that they're depicted on screen, they're a mob. And they're, trying to force the American people out. And it's not very reflective. And there's this sense that Canadians always just follow America. At the end of season 5, for example, June, does her iconic look into the camera and says, speaking on Canada, this country is changing. America wasn't Gilead until it was. So her and her husband have to go on the run because there's an implication that Canada is following in the footsteps to become Gilead. And I think, when I first saw 3 years ago that clip, I was so scared. The Roe v. Wade had just been overturned. But now when I saw that clip in the recap, I was so much more hopeful. And, there was a sense that Canada would maybe follow America. But actually, as we've seen with this election with Trump, when Canadians look at America, they do respond in a cautionary way. And there is a huge shift in Canada to not copy them. So I think that the show represents Canada in a strange way. And that clip that you just played is the Canadian, I don't know, representative in Gilead implying that she will mass deport all of the Americans back to Gilead, which I could just never see happening.
Moira, what's your take on this as an American watching that element of the story play out?
Yeah, I think in some ways, as the show has become maybe a little softer in its feminism over the course of these seasons, it's become a little more complicated, maybe a little more nuanced about Canada, right? Because in the early seasons, I think the show depicts Canada as almost like a promised land, right? Like this, and this is, sort of a piece with the way that like liberal Americans can imagine Canada. It's like, well, if it all goes downhill here, we always have Toronto.
Yeah, it's like some refuge in the imagination of some Americans. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a way that sort of understanding Canada almost as like a resource is perpetually available to Americans, right? Which I think is a little bit mistaken. and later when the characters are in Canada, Canada becomes a place that has its own tensions, its own internal contradictions. It's not merely a place where there is morality and calm and hence no plot, right? It is a place that has internal conflicts. So, in the later seasons, Canada has tensions arising from its large refugee population, right? And I think that's very similar to what we've seen in some like European countries, for instance, where you have rising tensions around refugee populations who've come in over the past several decades from like the Middle East and North Africa. In Canada, you have a Christian right in the show who are depicted as not merely horrified by Gilead, but also in some sense like aspirational of Gilead, right? So Canada changes from a morally unnuanced character to one in which there are people who have their own conflicts, people capable of, moral complication, let's say. And then this starts to play into the depiction of Canadian politics, which I think on some level, it's maybe less flattering to Canada, but it's a little more humanizing, right? It depicts Canada as a place where politics continues.
Yeah, I'm relieved to be morally complex, just like as a people. You know what I mean? Like it's nice to have a bit of depth. Like, oh, we're not just some sort of perfectly moral haven, because we certainly are not. We are a country working through a lot of different questions at all the times. Arizona, you had your hand up there because you're like, I'm ready to get in here. Let's go. What do you got?
Well, I always disliked the depiction in the early, in season 1 of Canada just being this kind of perfect haven. But the way the show has gone forward is kind of, I think, is trying to prove that Canada is a hypocrite. And that's the kind of American writing of it. And Margaret Atwood addresses this in her second follow-up book, The Testaments, which goes completely off from the show. And she paints a complex and nuanced picture of Canada, highlighting its strengths and weaknesses, and suggesting that in even a free society, vigilance and activism is necessary to protect and ensure freedom. So, that is not really actually at all depicted in the show. I find this kind of Canada fighting for its rights. The only Canadians we see are the ones that are protesting Americans. And as Moira said, the Canadians that are addicted to this idea of being Gilead themselves. So, yeah.
Well, to that end, Arizona, though, like when we say this political moment, we, I think, too often refer to what's happening politically in America. But we are also in the middle of an election campaign in this country right now. How do you think this show is resonating in that context? Is there any intersection there that you see?
Of course. I mean, even just parallels between the American election and Canadian election, we see J.D. Vance encouraging people to have children. And, just this has been in the news past week, but Pierre Poilievre saying that women are desperate to buy a home before their biological clock runs out, I was like, are they? No one in my family has ever owned a home, yet they've had children. Therefore, there's this big implication on who he's speaking about, which demographic of people they want to have children. And that is so Handmaid's Tale. And I would also like to point out that Pierre Polyev looks a lot like a commander.
Okay.
So that's always in the back of my head.
There's not a chance.
hair,
There's not a
yeah.
chance I'm going to comment on that part that you just said. But I will say that the story that you're referring to there, though, is Polyev's campaign has said that they're talking about housing affordability for young people, and that he was referencing like this story that StatsCan put out that said people are having children later and later, and so he said he was talking about housing affordability. But I take your point about the comment about the biological clock. Moira, I want to read you a passage from this piece that you wrote in the New Yorker with the Handmaid's Tale. So this is going back to that idea that we mentioned earlier, because it's in the context of markedly quieter protests in response to Donald Trump's second presidency. So when we're asking what happened to the resistance, you say, The Handmaid's Tale offers a clue. Its proponents were stymied by attacks from allies vulnerable to grapple with the strength and virulence of their enemy, and ultimately became too tame, too conciliatory, too afraid to be unpopular, and too alienated from the movement's radical roots. The protesters who remain are unable to launch a serious effort to defeat Trumpism because, like the series, they no longer quite know what they believe in. This is the grand thesis that you're sort of advancing here, is that there's something about the softening of both the show, but also the maybe more, I guess, like much stronger presentation of feminism that was able to come up with a response to Donald Trump's first presidency. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on the relationship between that softening you see in the show and maybe the quieter protests for the second Trump presidency?
Yeah, in the early years of the show and those early years of the Trump presidency, one of the most pointed critiques that the show got, I think some of these critiques were somewhat fair. Like, I think its depiction of race is strange, but there's one theme of that sort of criticism of the show's early seasons is that it was like a little too overwrought about the threats to women's rights, right? Like that it was taking the prospect of feminism's regression a little too seriously in a way that may have been like self-serving or morally flattering for its audience. I think that criticism has more or less been proven wrong by events, right? But I think there is a way in which perhaps The Handmaid's Tale took that critique a little too much to heart, right? Because in its anticipatory seasons before history sort of caught up with the show a little bit, it was very strident. And now, in retrospect, when the show could become a little more confident in its feminist politics, right, it actually seems a little bit exhausted, a little bit defeated. And I think there's something similar in that political arc of the narrative of the show that you can see in the political arc of the U.S. liberal resistance. You're seeing a little bit of a revival of that kind of political energy, but there's a sense in which, these are people who have had what they see as the means for advancing political change sort of foreclosed to them, which they have had to be resisting this administration and the movement that accompanies it for perhaps longer than they thought they would have, and in which their reserves of energy and hopefulness and determination feel depleted. And I think that there's something akin to the loss of energy in the show and the loss of energy in the liberal political movement in the U.S.
I think here's where that argument really resonates with me. In Arizona, I'll give you the last word here, is that when you're right, you get to say that, actually my prescription is also right. And the Handmaid's Tale's argument is they've diagnosed the problem correctly, they've diagnosed the outcomes correctly, but then they started pulling the punches in terms of the prescriptions of how you deal with that problem. So I think there was something more strident, as Moira said, that maybe feels a little bit less, less so in this moment. So with maybe like about a minute left here, Arizona, you have a different take. You still believe in the power of the Handmaid's Tale. Why do you still believe?
Well, I think like Moira is saying, there is something maybe more nuanced in the feminism in the later seasons. I think, a very interesting dynamic is the one with Serena, and where does she go from here? And in season 5, it seemed like there was going to be a redemption for her, which really upset me because I didn't really know what that angle was. But season 6 squashes it immediately and seems like it's making her the villain of the season. And there's this really interesting comparison between June being a mother of a daughter and Serena being a mother of a mother of a daughter and a mother of a son, and how that feminism plays. So I think that there's actually levels of feminism and conversations about motherhood and being a woman in the later seasons that in the earlier seasons it was very black and white, like these are the villains and these are the heroes. But in this one, I actually like the murkiness.
I gotta leave it there, unfortunately. That's why the music started coming up. But Moira Donegan, Arizona O'Neil, I appreciate your time. This has been wonderful. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. We are going to be back tomorrow. I would love to see you then.